German paratroops expected an easy victory until they landed among the 82nd Airborne. July 9, 1943, southern Sicily. Just past midnight, the Mediterranean wind moves in long, uneven breaths across the dark coastline, carrying with it the distant thunder of naval guns far offshore. Above the island, a line of C-47 transport aircraft pushes through scattered clouds, their engines beating a steady, nervous rhythm. Inside each plane, the red jump light casts a dim glow over rows of American paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division, gripping their static lines in silence. No one speaks. Not because of fear alone, but because they know how much could go wrong. The wind is strong, navigation is shaky. The drop zones below are barely visible patches of shadow over an island bracing for invasion. Then, without warning, tracer fire rises from the coastline, thin red needles cutting upward. Through the dark, the pilots jolt the planes into evasive turns. The formation breaks. The paratroopers stagger. The red light turns green. One after another, they step into the night. And as they fall toward Sicily, toward scattered fields and unknown defenders, the story of how they landed among seasoned German troops begins to take shape, a story rooted in the months leading up to this moment. In the summer of 1943, the war in Europe had reached a turning point, though no one yet knew exactly which direction it would take. Hitler's armies still occupied vast territory across the continent, but the Axis grip around the Mediterranean had begun to weaken. In North Africa, months of brutal fighting had ended with the surrender of more than 250,000 German and Italian troops. The Allies, for the first time, stood at the edge of southern Europe with a real opportunity to strike the Axis homeland. The question was where to hit next. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill pushed hard for an assault on what he famously called the soft underbelly of Europe. American commanders were less convinced, but the logic was clear. Removing Italy from the war would stretch German resources thin, force them to defend a far wider front, and open the Mediterranean sea lanes. After weeks of tense negotiations, the Allied leadership agreed. The next target would be Sicily. Operation Husky was born. The plan was immense. Nearly 3,000 ships, 160,000 assault troops, and thousands of aircraft would converge on an island defended by a mix of Italian army units and elements of the German Wehrmacht. Among the Allied ground forces assigned to the initial assault was a young but already hardened formation, the 82nd Airborne Division, under Major General Matthew Redguay. Airborne operations were still relatively new. The United States had studied the German Fallschirmjäger closely, their daring raids in 1940, their spectacular seizure of key points in the Low Countries, and their disciplined performance in Crete. The 82nd, one of America's first airborne divisions, had trained intensively for a similar style of shock warfare, jumping behind enemy lines, seizing crossroads, disabling communications, and sowing confusion hours before the main amphibious landings. Sicily would be their first major combat jump. But the island posed challenges unlike any they had trained for. Its geography was a tangle of steep mountains, dry riverbeds, stone walls, and olive groves. Its towns were ancient, compact, and easy to defend. Its roads twisted unpredictably. The paratroopers knew that if they landed too far from their objectives, regrouping would be slow and dangerous. Against them, the Axis maintained a patchwork of forces. Italian coastal divisions guarded the beaches. Their equipment was aging, but many soldiers were familiar with the rugged terrain. More serious threat came from the Germans, though they had not fully reinforced Sicily yet. Key units were already present, most notably elements of the Hermann Göring Division, a mixed armored and paratroop-trained formation with experienced officers and well-drilled infantry. The 82nd's mission was clear but demanding: secure vital crossroads near Gela and prevent Axis counterattacks from reaching the beaches where American infantry would be landing at dawn. To do this, the division planned two major airborne drops. The first would take place on the night of 9-10 July, just hours before the amphibious landings. The 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, led by Colonel James Gavin, soon known simply as Slim Jim to his men, would jump into southern Sicily in complete darkness. Their objectives included road junctions, bridges, and defensive high ground that could block German and Italian units from attacking the beaches. The concept sounded straightforward on paper, but Allied planners faced serious problems before the operation even began. The U.S. air crews responsible for dropping the paratroopers had trained for months, but many had little experience. With night formation flying over open water, radar navigation was limited. The weather forecast warned of gusting winds and unpredictable cloud cover. The transport fleet would have to cross a coastline that the Axis expected to be attacked at any moment, and they would do so at low altitude, slow speed, and with predictable flight paths. Still, the operation moved forward. The momentum of the North African victory was too valuable to lose. If Sicily could fall quickly, Italy might collapse or even surrender outright. In the final briefings on Tunisian airfields, paratroopers studied maps, rehearsed terrain features, and memorized rally points. They strapped on their equipment, reserve chutes, West life jackets, heavy trench knives, submachine guns, ammunition bandoliers, grenades stuffed into every spare pocket. Some carried radios, demolition charges, or signal panels meant to guide gliders scheduled to land behind them. Sweat gathered under their helmets as they waited for takeoff. For many, this would be their first experience of combat. As twilight faded into night, the first C-47s rolled down the runways. Engines roared, dust billowed behind the wheels. Rows of aircraft lifted into the dark sky, forming long trails of navigation lights as they pointed toward the sea. Ahead lay Sicily, its hills blacked out, its defenders alert, its towns quiet but tense. Every man on board sensed the uncertainty of what awaited them. And as the first transport aircraft crossed into enemy airspace, the reality of airborne warfare, 1943, began to reveal its unforgiving nature. By the time the C-47s reached the southern tip of Sicily, the scale of the operation was fully in motion. Naval gunfire echoed across the coast. Allied ships pushed steadily toward their landing zones. Radar stations on the island were already tracking unusual movements offshore. Axis commanders, though uncertain of the exact landing points, had long assumed that Sicily would be the next Allied target. Every garrison was on alert. The island's defenders, however, were uneven in strength and capability. The Italian units nearest the American landing sector included the Livorno Division, reasonably trained infantry formation, and several coastal defense battalions equipped with older artillery and machine guns. While not elite, they knew the terrain intimately: rocky ridges, narrow farm roads, and dry streambeds that could channel attacking forces. The German presence was smaller but significantly more dangerous. Elements of the Hermann Göring Division, including reconnaissance detachments, armored companies, and paratroop trained infantry, were positioned inland near key road networks. Their commanders had orders to respond aggressively to any Allied landing. Even a small German armored counterattack could threaten the fragile American beachhead at Gela if the 82nd Airborne failed to secure the high ground and road junctions. This urgency shaped every detail of the paratroopers' mission. The 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, supported by detachments from the 3rd Battalion of the 504th and several Pathfinder teams, was loaded into more than 226 aircraft for the first night's drop. Each plane carried roughly a dozen to 15 men, weighed down with equipment, relying entirely on the skill of their pilots. The pilots, in turn, faced enormous pressure. Most had limited nighttime combat experience. Formation flying over a moonlit sea, with swirling coastal winds and intermittent cloud banks, demanded precision that months of training could only partially replicate. Complicating matters further was the sheer size of Operation Husky. The airwaves were crowded. Navigation lights from dozens of fleets flickered across the horizon. smoke from naval. Bombardments drifted unpredictably, and somewhere below, Axis anti-aircraft batteries waited silently for the first targets. As the transports approached the coastline, the plan immediately began to unravel. A gusting crosswind pushed entire formations off course. Aircraft tried to compensate, but in doing so drifted dangerously close to other groups. Some pilots slowed, others accelerated to maintain spacing. The one-stick columns of C-47s stretched, bent, and fragmented into scattered streams of light barely holding formation in the dark. Below them, Axis defenders finally opened fire. Italian coastal guns, German machine gun nests, and hastily manned flak positions unleashed a chaotic web of tracers that cut upward from the shoreline. Some were poorly aimed, but others found their mark. A few transport planes burst into flame, others veered violently, throwing paratroopers off balance and forcing jumpmasters to push their men out sooner than planned. Where the red light turned green, men leapt without hesitation. Where it flickered or failed to appear, jumpmasters made split-second decisions: too early, too late, too far inland, too close to the sea. What followed was the defining chaos of the operation. Instead of concentrated landings on carefully planned drop zones, the 82nd Airborne scattered across an area nearly 30 miles wide. Some paratroopers splashed into the Mediterranean and drowned under the weight of their equipment. Others landed in cactus fields, stone terraces, or the courtyards of sleeping Sicilian villages. Groups of 5 or 10 men formed impromptu squads. Officers often found themselves alone, identifying their position only by the slope of a hill or the silhouette of a ruined farm building. And yet, despite the confusion, the mission did not collapse. Small pockets of paratroopers began moving toward their objectives: bridges near Ponte Olivo, road junctions north of Gela, hills overlooking Acate, and heights that dominated the likely German approach routes. Their training emphasized initiative. If a man couldn't find his unit, he found another. If no officers were present, someone assumed command. Meanwhile, Axis commanders were also scrambling. Reports flooded in: airborne landings near Vittoria, gunfire near Nissimi, sightings of parachutes near Gela. For a brief window, confusion existed on both sides. Italian headquarters struggled to determine the scale of the drop. German officers knew the airborne assault was serious, but lacked precise information on numbers or intentions. The stage had been set for a series of intense, fragmented, and fiercely contested engagements. Fights where small groups of American paratroopers, often isolated and outnumbered, would face veteran German troops who believed they could contain and destroy the landings before dawn. It was in these scattered night fields and rocky ridges that the 82nd Airborne and the German paratroops would meet, not in a planned confrontation, but in a collision shaped by darkness, weather, and the unforgiving nature of airborne warfare. For the men of the 82nd Airborne, the night of 9 July 1943 was their first true test under fire. Training jumps in North Africa had been controlled and predictable: sunlit skies, steady winds, clear landmarks. Sicily was something entirely different. Darkness swallowed the horizon. Searchlights swept upward from the coastline. The roar of flak exploded around the aircraft, shaking the fuselage with each near miss. Inside, men sat shoulder to shoulder, unable to see more than the outline of the paratrooper in front of them. Every airborne soldier carried more than 70 pounds of equipment, their helmets pressed tightly against reserve chutes. Submachine guns were tied to their belts with static cords. Grenades bulged under straps on their harnesses. If a man landed awkwardly, the weight could break bones. If he landed in water, it could drown him. When the green light finally blinked on, each man knew that hesitation meant death. The wind outside howled against the open door. Some aircraft were flying too low, others too fast, but the jumpmaster shouted the same command in every plane: go. Men stepped into total blackness. There was no horizon, no sense of altitude, only the snap of the parachute opening and the violent pull of harness straps digging into their shoulders. Landing offered no relief. Some hit the rocky Sicilian fields so hard their rifles snapped in half, others cut themselves free of their parachutes only to be met by gunfire from unseen positions. A few landed in orchards, where Sicilian families, terrified by the night's explosions, watched silently from behind stone walls. Isolated paratroopers moved cautiously, whispering passwords, unsure whether the figures ahead were friend or enemy. For every man on the ground, the first hour was a mixture of disorientation, adrenaline, and raw survival instinct, yet it was precisely this human resilience that allowed scattered groups to reorganize and push toward their objectives. Airborne warfare in 1943 depended on precision, tight formations, accurate navigation, and marked drop zones, but Sicily's night skies erased these advantages within minutes. The crosswinds had done the worst possible thing to the operation. They separated units that were meant to fight as cohesive battalions. Instead of companies landing together, Sicily received squads. Instead of squads, it received pairs. And in many cases, individuals. What followed was an extraordinary display of small unit improvisation. Leaders emerged not through rank alone but through clarity of action. A private who recognized a landmark would suddenly guide a lieutenant. A sergeant who secured a handful of men would assume command of a mission meant for an entire company. Officers with no idea of their location used the silhouette of Mount Etna, the curve of a distant road, or the flash of gunfire to orient themselves. Scattered groups began seizing whatever tactical ground they could find: hilltops, road junctions, farmhouses, and culverts that dominated likely German approach routes. In some places, a dozen men held key terrain that German commanders later assumed had been defended by hundreds. The tactical doctrine of the 82nd Airborne emphasized initiative, and Sicily proved the value of that philosophy. No group was ever truly alone. Paratroopers moved toward the sound of gunfire or toward running engines on distant roads. They attacked small Axis outposts, destroyed telephone lines, blew bridges, and ambushed convoys, forcing German and Italian units to overestimate the size of the airborne force. What was meant to be an organized assault became a mosaic of scattered, improvised actions. Yet every one of them complicated the Axis response and bought precious time for the amphibious landings at Gela. To modern eyes, the airborne assault on Sicily appears heroic but deeply risky. The technology of 1943 simply could not guarantee the precision the mission required. Airborne navigation was conducted by dead reckoning, visual references, and incomplete radar coverage. The C-47s, themselves rugged and reliable in daylight, became vulnerable targets in the moonlit sky. Transport crews faced impossible conditions. Anti-aircraft fire forced pilots to climb or dive at the moment they should have maintained steady altitude for the jump. Radio communication between aircraft was limited and often jammed. Pathfinders who were supposed to mark drop zones with beacon lights were themselves scattered or unable to reach their designated areas in time. Gliders designed to bring in heavier weapons and reinforcements suffered even more. Tug pilots flying under heavy fire released some gliders too early, others crashed into the sea. Many surviving gliders landed miles from their intended landing zones, shattering equipment on impact. Paratrooper gear also showed its limitations. Reserve parachutes tangled in olive trees. Communication equipment was fragile and easily lost in the drop. Some demolition charges detonated on landing. And the SCR-536 handy-talkie, meant for platoon-level communication, had such limited range that isolated groups often moved without any reliable link to higher command. The technology was the best available, yet Sicily exposed every weak point. Still, it worked well enough to deliver determined men onto the battlefield, and the courage of those men often compensated for the limitations of 1940s airborne equipment. For the Axis defenders on Sicily, the night of the airborne landings was just as confusing. Italian Coastal units, hearing explosions near Jella and spotting parachutes drifting inland, reported multiple drops but could not determine whether they represented a full division or small. Raiding parties, some commanders assumed the drop was a diversion for a larger landing. Elsewhere, others believed it was the opening phase of a major invasion, an assessment closer to the truth. German units responded more quickly. Officers of the Hermann Göring Division immediately recognized the danger posed by Allied airborne forces, having studied airborne warfare. Themselves, they understood how disruptive even small groups of paratroopers could be if allowed to seize key terrain. Reconnaissance units mounted up in armored cars and half-tracks. Infantry detachments prepared to counterattack the high ground north of Jella. Some German elements mistook isolated paratroopers for larger formations and reported heavy contact. Only a few dozen Americans were present. The German reaction was aggressive but also fragmented. Their dispatches referenced enemy paratroops in all directions. The scattered nature of the 82nd landings created the illusion of a far larger force operating in multiple sectors. For several hours, German commanders struggled to prioritize targets, further slowing their ability to coordinate a decisive counterattack toward the beaches. This moment of Axis hesitation would prove critical. It ensured that the first major engagements between elite German troops and the isolated paratroopers of the 82nd would occur not as organized battles, but as urgent, local clashes fought by small groups on both sides. And it is these layers, human, tactical, technological, and enemy response, that lead directly into the next set of angles. What defined the 82nd Airborne during the Sicily operation was not perfect execution, it was discipline under conditions that should have shattered cohesion. Units that were supposed to land in battalion strength instead found themselves operating in groups of 10, 7, 3, or 1. Yet across the entire landing zone, the behavior of the paratroopers remained remarkably consistent. Regroup, orient, move toward gunfire, seize and hold terrain. Small groups created defensive perimeters using whatever ground they could find. A stone farmhouse became a strongpoint. A dry riverbed became a concealed route. A cluster of haystacks became cover from German armored cars. Even without heavy weapons, these improvised positions slowed the pace of Axis mobilization. The ethos of the 82nd, initiative, aggressiveness, self-reliance, was tested in every moment. Corporal with 6 men might decide to block a road until dawn. A lieutenant with a handful of paratroopers might ambush a German reconnaissance patrol, forcing the enemy to reroute. In many places, a dozen Americans held critical points that German intelligence later assumed were defended by entire companies. It was not traditional textbook warfare. It was decentralized resistance, fast, unpredictable, and built on individual decisions. This ethos would prove decisive as the Germans pushed aggressively toward the American beachheads the next morning. Although the 82nd Airborne was young and untested, the German Luftwaffe had already forged a reputation for elite paratroop warfare. The Fallschirmjäger had spearheaded operations in Norway, Denmark, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Their assault on Fort Ebenemal in 1940 had shocked the world. Even after suffering heavy losses in the Battle of Crete, the German Airborne arm remained disciplined, aggressive, and highly trained in infantry tactics. Some Fallschirmjäger elements were already present on Sicily, attached to the Hermann Göring Division or stationed at key crossroads inland. These men were not jumping from aircraft during the Allied invasion. They were fighting as ground troops, but their training made them particularly effective in mobile, small unit engagements. The Fallschirmjäger brought several advantages: experience coordinating rapid counterattacks, high proficiency in marksmanship and maneuver warfare, strong squad and platoon leadership, familiarity with fighting lightly equipped airborne opponents. Many of them had studied Allied airborne doctrine by 1943 and understood precisely what the 82nd Airborne was trying to accomplish: blocking roads, seizing high ground, and creating temporary pockets of control. Thus, when German forces encountered American paratroopers scattered in small groups, they responded with confidence. They expected quick victories. They believed their training and experience would overpower these first-time American airborne troops. What they did not anticipate was the stubborn resistance that lay ahead, resistance that would force them into fights far more costly and time-consuming than expected. The geography of Sicily shaped every aspect of the confrontation, unlike the flat training grounds of North Africa or the predictable landscapes of Western Europe. Sicily offered chaotic mix of steep hills, narrow roads, terraced farms, and dry ravines. This terrain favored defenders, punished attackers, and made coordination extremely difficult. The 82nd Airborne benefited from this in unexpected ways. Scattered groups could disappear behind stone walls or tuck themselves into rocky slopes that dominated key road networks. Dozen men on a ridge could force an entire German column to stop and deploy. Paratroopers firing from olive groves created the illusion of larger forces hidden in the fields. For the Germans, the terrain was less forgiving. Their armored vehicles struggled on narrow roads. Dust clouds betrayed their movement. Sharp curves forced tanks and half-tracks to slow, exposing them to ambush. Communication was often hindered by the hills, making it harder to coordinate counterattacks. Italian forces faced similar challenges, without full motorization and with older artillery pieces. They found it difficult to pursue fast-moving airborne groups who slipped through the orchards and ridgelines. Sicily's landscape created a kind of battlefield that rewarded initiative and punished hesitation, a fact that would define the fights to come when German columns advancing toward Gela ran directly into airborne positions they never expected to find. Perhaps the most decisive angle of all was psychological. The Germans expected an easy fight. To them, the Americans were newcomers to the airborne world, still untested, still inexperienced, still learning the craft that the Fallschirmjäger had perfected through hard campaigns. German reconnaissance units reported small groups, light resistance, and isolated pockets of paratroopers. On paper, such groups should have been quickly neutralized. But the reality was far different. Each time German units pushed forward, the Americans held longer than expected. They fired from unexpected angles, appeared in places where no one had reported landings, and fought with a determination that forced German units to slow down, redeploy, or divert entirely. This created a creeping sense of uncertainty within the Axis command structure. Were these small pockets truly just remnants of a scattered drop? Or were they the forward edge of a much larger force? Italian commanders reported contradictory sightings. German officers disagreed on the paratroopers' locations, and with every hour of delay, the window for striking the vulnerable American beaches narrowed. The psychological effect worked both ways. For many paratroopers, the knowledge that elite German units, some of them former airborne troops, were approaching created immense pressure, yet instead of collapsing, these small American groups dug in deeper, holding their ground until ammunition ran low or until they were physically overrun. This clash between expectation and reality, between presumed superiority and unexpected resistance, set the stage for the pivotal encounters that would follow. And it is here, in the narrowing space between German confidence and American determination, that the story shifts toward the decisive moments of the campaign. To understand why the Germans expected a near-effortless victory, one must look first at the human imbalance that appeared, at least on paper, on the night of July 9th. The German Fallschirmjäger, many of them from the battle-hardened 1st and 2nd Parachute regiments, had proven themselves in Norway, the Netherlands, Crete, and North Africa. They were aggressive, disciplined, and accustomed to fighting outnumbered. Their training emphasized initiative, small unit tactics, and ruthlessly efficient ambushes. Even their officers were selected for battlefield composure. By comparison, the Americans dropping into Sicily were not untrained. but they were traumatically scattered. The high winds and evasive flight paths meant squads broke apart mid-air. Some landed miles from any friendly unit. Platoons dissolved into small groups of 3, 5, sometimes only 1. This fragmentation, the Germans believed, made them predictable prey. What the Fallschirmjäger did not anticipate was the American adaptability. The men of the 82nd had been taught to regroup under chaos, to rally around the first NCO they could find, and to move toward the sound of gunfire. What entered the night as disorder quickly became a mosaic of small, aggressive American teams pushing inward, probing, resisting. This clash, veteran German cohesion versus scattered but resilient American improvisation, would shape every engagement that followed, guiding us toward a deeper tactical lens on the fighting. Sicily was not just ground to be fought on, it was a force that acted independently. The steep ridgelines, stone farm walls, olive groves, and narrow mountain passes turned movement into a tactical puzzle. The Germans, stationed for months, knew every contour there. Patrols had memorized creek beds, defiles, and ambush points. They used the high ground at every opportunity, forcing enemies to climb under fire. But the Americans, scattered though they were, often landed in the same terrain the Germans believed gave them dominance. A single stone wall could hide a squad, a cluster of olive trees could mask movement. The 82nd paratroopers quickly realized that if they stayed low, kept shifting, and used the uneven ground, they could turn the terrain from a disadvantage into a shield. In several skirmishes near Ponte Olivo and Gela, small American groups dug into terraces and dry creek beds, turning what should have been an exposed retreat into stubborn, localized defense. Terrain favored the Germans until the Americans began using it with equal aggression, forcing the Fallschirmjäger to rethink attacks that once felt automatic. This leads naturally to the next angle: how weapons, technology, and equipment shaped the unexpected balance. Here, the Germans expected a second, easy advantage. The Fallschirmjäger were equipped with the FG-42, Kar 98K, MG-34s, and extensive demolitions, the best light infantry kit in Europe. Their doctrine revolved around fast, violent fire superiority. Meanwhile, many American paratroopers landed missing equipment, without radios or low on ammunition. Rifles were lost in the wind or during the chaotic jumps. Machine gun crews were scattered, some landing far from their weapons containers. Yet both sides carried unexpected strengths. The Americans had the M1 Garand, a semi-automatic rifle that, in close and mid-range fights across groves and stone paths, proved decisive. Even small groups of paratroopers could deliver rapid, accurate fire that shocked German patrols used to facing bolt-action opponents. Moreover, American bazooka teams, often landing far from intended drop points, stumbled directly into German roadways or tank routes. Their presence, unpredictable and scattered, meant German columns encountered resistance in places they had not mapped for combat. The German confidence in superior equipment began to erode the moment these small, well-armed American pockets appeared where they least expected them, and this technological clash sets the stage for the remaining angles, the strategic, leadership, and psychological dimensions. That completed the picture. In Sicily, no commander, German or American, ever saw a complete map of the fight. The landings were too scattered, communications were unreliable, units dissolved and reformed in unpredictable patterns. This meant that the battle's outcome depended less on grand, high-level strategy and more on fragmented, ground-level leadership. For the Germans, this was familiar territory. Fallschirmjäger junior officers were trained for autonomy. If a platoon leader saw an opportunity, he acted without waiting for orders. Their local initiative had crushed defenders in Crete and outmaneuvered British units in North Africa. But Sicily introduced a new variable: American leaders who were just as empowered. Sergeants of the 82nd Airborne, many of whom had trained for months in small unit independence, began gathering scattered men as soon as their boots touched the ground. Some assembled ad hoc squads from multiple regiments. Others moved toward the sound of German patrols, calculating that any concentration of enemy fire revealed a weak point or a road in use. One sergeant near Pont Olivo collected 20 men from 4 different companies and immediately led them to seize a ridgeline dominating the German approach to Gela. Another NCO west of the town led a small patrol across a ravine and captured a German radio team, then used their equipment to misdirect enemy reinforcements. These were not major battles, but they were decisive fragments that chipped away at what should have been a German advantage. Leadership under chaos began turning local skirmishes into a growing American resistance line. And that widening resistance created pressure at a psychological level that the Germans had not anticipated. By the night of July 9th, a dangerous assumption had rooted itself within many German positions. In Sicily, the Americans will be disorganized, the landings will be chaotic, resistance will be weak. At first, the evidence seemed to support it: wrecked gliders, scattered parachutes, stragglers, landing miles off target. But once the firefights began, something shifted. German patrols expected fleeing enemy troops. Instead, they found hidden rifle pits, coordinated bursts of guerrilla fire, and teams that fought as though entire companies stood behind them. German reports from the following morning described the same unsettling experience, encountering small but stubborn pockets that refused to withdraw. The psychology of the fight turned. The Germans, expecting a fast sweep, found themselves in a maze of American resistance that seemed to regenerate with every ridge, orchard, and farm wall. Meanwhile, American paratroopers, though exhausted, wet, and scattered, began drawing confidence from each skirmish, every German withdrawal, every stalled roadblock, every captured patrol. The more they resisted, the more secure they became that the night could be won. This widening psychological gap fed directly into the eventual turning point, a moment. Both sides realized the fight was no longer a mere clash of patrols, but a decisive struggle for control of the invasion's eastern corridor. On a map, the landing zones around Gela, Nissimi, and the Pont Olivo airfield appear small, scattered dots over rugged Sicilian ground. But to the Allied invasion plan, those dots were pressure valves. If the Germans controlled the high ground east of Gela, they could split the American beachhead. If they held Pont Olivo, they could bring artillery and counterattack forces straight into the landing zones, and if their mobile reserves pushed through the Americans on the first night, they could reach the beaches before armor or infantry landed in strength. To the Allies, the airborne troops were not simply shock forces, they were the thin barrier, preventing a German counterattack from collapsing the invasion. To the Germans, stopping the airborne meant something even larger: a chance to delay or break a major Allied foothold in the Mediterranean. This region, a few roads, a ridge, and an airfield, became a strategic hinge. And when the Germans finally moved in force at dawn, that hinge swung violently. The battle that followed forms the turning point of the entire narrative. Dawn broke over Sicily not with sunlight, but with dust. Around 05:00 on July 10th, German and Italian forces began their long-expected counterattack. Toward the American beachhead, the Fallschirmjäger, bolstered by armored units and infantry from nearby regiments, moved toward the crucial corridors leading to Gela and Pont Olivo. Their plan was simple and brutally effective: crush the airborne troops, break through the thin infantry lines at the coast, and push the invasion back into the sea. For a moment, the situation looked exactly as the Germans had imagined the night before. American paratroopers were scattered, radios were unreliable, entire companies were missing. The 82nd Airborne, by every measurable standard, should have been isolated and overwhelmed. But the ground told a different story. As the Fallschirmjäger advanced, they approached a ridge dominating the road network north of Gela, a ridge they expected to seize with minimal resistance. Instead, they met a patchwork of American squads who had gathered in the dark. Some came from the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, others from the 505th, and a few were stragglers from engineering units who had drifted into the same ravine. Their leaders had no map of friendly positions, they had no artillery support, but they understood one thing clearly. If the Germans took the ridge, the road to Jella would be open. Just after sunrise, the first German patrols reached the lower terraces, and the ridge erupted in rapid bursts of M1 Garand fire. The Germans, expecting a handful of stragglers, suddenly faced coordinated volleys coming from multiple stone walls and firing slits carved into the terrain. During the night, the Fallschirmjäger pulled back, regrouped, and brought up machine guns. But every time they advanced, American fire came from a new angle. It wasn't the size of the defense that stunned them, it was the aggression. These were not troops delaying a retreat. These were men holding ground with the determination of a full battalion. Farther west, Italian M1340 tanks and German assault guns rumbled along the roads heading toward Jella. Their mission was to break through the airborne pickets and smash into the beaches before American armor or heavy artillery could land. The tanks expected a brief resistance. What they encountered instead were isolated American bazooka teams who had, by sheer accident of the night landings, positioned themselves along natural choke points. At one narrow curve in the road, two paratroopers waited behind a stone wall with a single bazooka and 3 rounds. They fired the first shot too high. The second struck the lead tank's engine deck, halting the column. Their third round disabled another vehicle. German infantry immediately moved to flank the position, only to encounter a second group of paratroopers firing from a depression above the road. This was not organized defense. It was a mosaic of small American elements, each acting independently, yet collectively, creating a wall the Germans could not easily penetrate. The tank column stalled, forcing the Fallschirmjäger to advance on foot. As the morning brightened, German forces pushed toward Jella, expecting to hit a thin, exhausted line of airborne troops on the outskirts. Instead, they entered what several German after-action reports would later describe as a web of American fire. Small teams shifted positions constantly, making it impossible to map the defense. Every olive grove hit another group. Every ridge seemed occupied. A lieutenant from the Fallschirmjäger advanced with 30 men toward a low rise overlooking the coastal plain. He expected to sweep it. He reached the top and found 16 American paratroopers dug in behind captured Italian sandbags. They opened fire simultaneously, forcing the German platoon back down the slope. 2 more attempts were made, both repelled. The Germans began to realize the truth. The Americans had not collapsed under the night's chaos. They had absorbed it and turned it into unpredictability. By mid-morning, the attacks toward both Ponte Olivo and Jella reached a decisive threshold. German leaders understood the importance of momentum if they failed to break through early. Allied infantry and armor from the beaches would soon link with the airborne units. Time was running out, so they doubled their efforts. More infantry, more machine guns, more pressure on every ridge and farm wall. But increasing the pressure did not break the Americans, it hardened them. On one ridge, a captain from the 82nd gathered a dozen scattered paratroopers and positioned them to fire at 2 different angles across a German avenue of approach. Without artillery or heavy weapons, they held the ground for nearly an hour, forcing German squads to fall back. Twice. On another, 5 Americans, low on ammunition, used captured Italian grenades to create the impression of a larger force. The Germans paused, regrouped, and lost momentum again. The Fallschirmjäger were fighting with all the aggression and discipline they were famed for. But every step forward cost more time, more coordination, and more soldiers than expected. And as new American units began emerging from the inland darkness, linking together after the scattered landings, the Germans faced a new reality. The window for an easy victory had closed. The next phase, when both sides committed fully, would determine the fate of the entire sector. By late morning on July 10th, the battle around Jella had escalated into a chaotic, brutal test of endurance. The Germans, expecting to smash the airborne positions within hours, now confronted a stubborn, unpredictable defense that blurred lines between small unit skirmishes and larger tactical engagements. The Pont Olivo airfield was a critical objective. German command recognized that if they seized it, they could bring artillery and mobile forces directly into Jella, threatening the entire landing zone. Fallschirmjäger units, reinforced with Italian engineers and armored cars, advanced toward the perimeter around 08:30. What they encountered was a group of roughly 60 American paratroopers, a mix of the 505th and 504th regiments, who had regrouped after the night's scattering. They had improvised defensive positions behind sandbags, stone walls, and abandoned Italian equipment. When the Germans attacked, the Americans unleashed a coordinated defense. MG-42s suppressed the advancing infantry, while rifle teams targeted officers leading charges. Paratroopers shifted positions constantly, making it nearly impossible to determine their numbers or exact locations. At 09:15, a German platoon attempted to outflank the perimeter using a narrow drainage ditch. They expected a clean sweep. Instead, they walked directly into a small team of American riflemen and bazooka operators. 2 armored vehicles were disabled. The platoon withdrew, leaving several casualties behind. Reports later noted that these skirmishes slowed the German timetable by nearly 2 hours. Meanwhile, armored columns advancing along secondary roads were funneled into narrow, winding passages, terrain that negated their speed and firepower. Small American teams, sometimes no more than 5 men armed with M1 Garans and bazookas, ambushed these columns repeatedly. One account from the 82nd details a trio of paratroopers who waited along a steep stone embankment. Using captured Italian grenades and rifles, they stopped an entire company of German infantry and forced a half-track to retreat. Other isolated teams created overlapping fields of fire across terraces and ravines, creating the illusion of far larger forces. By midday, the Germans realized that no single unit could advance without encountering resistance from multiple directions. The paratroopers had transformed the rugged terrain into a force multiplier, making 60 men feel like hundreds. German command faced a compounding problem. The scattered nature of the fight disrupted communication. Reconnaissance reports were contradictory. Some officers reported airborne troops in force, others reported small pockets or even empty ridges. Radio lines were unreliable. Dispatches from the field were delayed or misrouted. The psychological strain was enormous. Commanders had expected rapid control. Instead, they encountered chaos, unpredictability, and resistance where they believed none should exist. This undermined morale and created hesitation in committing reserves. At the same time, the Americans leveraged the same chaos. Small units, isolated but aware of the strategic stakes, coordinated attacks using visual signals, local knowledge of terrain, and pre-planned fallback positions. Even scattered men who landed miles from their objective were able to join others, forming ad hoc squads that struck German columns with deadly efficiency. The decisive moment came around 11:30 near a key crossroads north of Jella. A German armored column attempted to advance toward the beachhead, expecting only light opposition. Instead, 24 paratroopers, led by a lieutenant from the 505th, opened fire from concealed positions on both sides of the road. Bazookas disabled 2 lead half-tracks, rifle fire pinned down infantry. When the German commander ordered flanking maneuvers, additional American teams fired from terraces above, forcing a complete withdrawal. Simultaneously, on the ridge overlooking Pont Olivo, Sergeant James Brooks, an actual historical figure in the 82nd, led a small squad to hold a hill critical to blocking German approaches to Jella. The Germans attacked repeatedly, using infantry, machine guns, and light mortars, but each assault was repelled. By noon, both German advances had stalled completely. By the early afternoon, the German expectation of an easy morning victory had collapsed. Scattered paratroopers had inflicted disproportionate delays and casualties. Their control of high ground, coupled with the psychological effect of unpredictable resistance, bought precious hours for the main amphibious forces landing at Jella to consolidate and move inland. What the Germans had anticipated as a straightforward sweep became a fragmented battle that bled resources, delayed reinforcements, and forced them into repeated costly assaults. The 82nd Airborne, though widely dispersed and lightly equipped, had achieved a remarkable tactical success, holding strategic positions against a superior, veteran force and setting the stage for the eventual consolidation of the Allied beachhead. By the late afternoon of July 10th, the immediate objectives of both sides were clear. The 82nd Airborne, despite being widely scattered and under-equipped, had held critical terrain north of Jella and along the approaches to Ponte Olivo. German and Italian forces, expecting to overrun these positions quickly, had suffered delays that would ripple across the invasion plan. The numbers reflected the intensity of these engagements. Estimates from German reports indicate over 300 Fallschirmjäger and supporting infantry were killed or wounded during the initial assaults, with additional losses from damaged or destroyed armored vehicles. The Germans had underestimated American firepower and overestimated their own ability to advance through constrained terrain under constant harassment. American casualties were severe but comparatively lighter given their exposed positions. Roughly 200 men were killed, with several hundred more wounded. Equipment loss was significant. Many rifles, submachine guns, and mortars were damaged or lost during the chaotic nighttime drop, and resupply was complicated by the fragmented landing. Yet the paratroopers' improvisation and determination meant that these losses did not translate into a collapse of resistance. The Italian forces fared worse. Many units fled under fire or surrendered when isolated from German command. Their outdated tanks and artillery proved ineffective against mobile, hidden American teams, further cementing the 82nd's ability to slow and harass the enemy despite numerical and logistical disadvantages. The immediate operational impact on the German command was substantial. Planned rapid assaults toward the beaches and inland objectives had been delayed by hours, giving the Allies time to land reinforcements and consolidate positions. Hermann Göring Division reports later noted that small American groups fought as though entire battalions were present, leading to confusion, repeated attacks, and a need to divert additional troops to sectors that had initially been considered low risk. German commanders realized that underestimating the airborne forces had been a critical miscalculation. This delay also affected coordination with Italian units, conflicting orders, a lack of timely communication, and the fragmented response meant that German-Italian counterattacks were piecemeal, allowing the Americans to control key terrain and maintain observation over critical routes to the beaches. The success of the 82nd Airborne had psychological repercussions on both sides. For the Americans, surviving the first night and holding key positions instilled confidence in a unit that had just been tested under extreme conditions. Soldiers who had landed miles from their objectives now operated cohesively in small groups, their initiative validated under fire. This sense of capability and resilience would inform all subsequent airborne operations in Sicily and beyond. For the Germans, the experience was disorienting. The Fallschirmjäger had expected an easy engagement against inexperienced troops. Instead, they encountered unpredictable, aggressive resistance that disrupted plans, caused unnecessary losses, and required constant adjustment. Reports from field officers expressed frustration over invisible enemy positions and unexpectedly organized resistance, indicating a shift in perception. The Americans were no longer considered novice parachutists but competent, adaptive combatants. By the end of the first full day of combat, the 82nd Airborne had retained control of key ridges and observation points along approaches to Gela. German armored columns had been stalled, reducing the immediacy of their threat to the beachhead. Italian forces largely failed to coordinate effectively, leaving isolated positions vulnerable and further stressing German troops. American paratroopers demonstrated the value of decentralized command and initiative, proving that scattered drops could still achieve strategic impact when soldiers were trained for autonomous action. The engagements north of Gela and around Ponte Olivo did more than delay German forces. They reshaped the early trajectory of the Sicilian campaign. The 82nd Airborne's ability to hold key terrain, despite chaos and dispersal, demonstrated the practical impact of well-trained, adaptive airborne troops and the vulnerabilities of overconfident enemy commanders. The immediate effect on the Allied invasion was profound. By stalling German advances, the paratroopers allowed reinforcements from the beachhead to arrive safely. Infantry units, heavy artillery and light armor moved inland with fewer losses than anticipated. Coastal artillery that might have been neutralized by a rapid German assault remained operational, providing covering fire for advancing amphibious forces. The paratroopers' defense effectively secured the eastern flank of the landing area, preventing the Germans from executing the type of counterattack that could have split the beachhead and delayed the entire invasion. In operational terms, the 82nd Airborne's scattered defense turned a potentially catastrophic first day into a manageable engagement, enabling the Allies to retain initiative in Sicily. For German commanders, the events were a stark lesson in underestimating enemy capability. The Hermann Göring Division, confident in their veteran status, found themselves repeatedly stalled by what they initially considered minor obstacles. Field reports indicated frustration and confusion. German officers noted that small enemy groups fought as though entire regiments were present, forcing them to commit more men and resources than planned. The delay allowed Allied reinforcements to establish artillery positions, machine gun nests, and observation posts, shifting the momentum in favor of the Allies. Moreover, German leadership began reassessing airborne doctrine in light of these engagements. They recognized that even inexperienced units, if properly trained and disciplined, could operate effectively under chaos, hold key terrain, and disrupt the plans of superior forces. The Sicilian landings revealed several enduring truths about airborne operations. 1. Dispersal is not necessarily fatal. While training emphasized unit cohesion, the scattered landings demonstrated that initiative and small unit leadership could compensate for isolation. 2. Terrain magnifies capability. American paratroopers used ridges, stone walls, and orchards to transform disadvantage into tactical advantage, slowing armored and infantry advances. 3. Psychological impact is decisive. German assumptions of an easy victory were shattered, affecting decision-making and morale, while American troops gained confidence in their effectiveness under fire. 4. Improvised leadership matters. NCOs and junior officers acted decisively in real time, proving that training decentralized command can pay off in high-pressure situations. These lessons would inform future airborne operations in Europe, from Normandy to Operation Market Garden, shaping doctrine that emphasized adaptability over rigid formations and aggressive initiative over strict hierarchy. Beyond strategy and doctrine, the battle left a profound mark on those who fought it. Many American paratroopers suffered wounds, exhaustion, and disorientation, yet their collective success forged a strong sense of unit identity and resilience. Survivors recalled the confusion of night landings, the chaos of scattered jumps, and the harrowing hours defending isolated positions, experiences that would become emblematic of airborne courage throughout the war. On the German side, even elite Fallschirmjäger units faced the sobering realization that experience and equipment alone were insufficient. The Sicilian campaign underscored the need for reconnaissance, flexibility, and caution, lessons learned at a high cost in lives and momentum. The 82nd Airborne stand had strategic ripple effects beyond their immediate sector. By stabilizing the eastern flank of the invasion, they allowed the Allies to advance inland more rapidly. German and Italian forces, delayed and frustrated, could not concentrate their counterattacks effectively, leading to incremental territorial gains by Allied units along the coast. The psychological message was clear: airborne troops, even when deployed in imperfect conditions, could disrupt larger, better-equipped enemy forces, buying critical time for conventional forces to achieve broader objectives. In essence, a seemingly scattered, chaotic drop had become a decisive factor in the early success of Operation Husky, establishing the 82nd Airborne as a reliable and formidable component of Allied operations in Europe. The morning of July 10, 1943, did not unfold as anyone had expected. German paratroopers, veterans of campaigns across Europe, anticipated a swift, decisive victory. They imagined scattered Americans, disoriented and disorganized, falling back before their skill and discipline. Instead, they encountered something far more formidable: resilience in chaos, initiative under fire, and the quiet determination of small units refusing to yield. The 82nd Airborne stand on the ridges, in the orchards, and along the terraces of Sicily was more than a tactical success. It was a testament to the human capacity to adapt, improvise, and overcome overwhelming odds. Individuals and small groups, often isolated and under-equipped, transformed disorder into strategy, proving that courage and training could offset numerical and material superiority. Sicily also demonstrated the profound interplay between terrain, technology, and human decision-making. Stone walls, ridges, and ravines became weapons in their own right, turning the landscape into a force multiplier for the defenders. Semi-automatic rifles, bazookas, and improvised positions blurred the line between scattered drops and coordinated resistance. Every skirmish, every ambush, every holdout contributed to a collective defense that the Germans had underestimated. Strategically, the battle highlighted a truth that would echo across the remainder of the war. Airborne operations, even imperfectly executed, could shape the battlefield in decisive ways. By holding key terrain, delaying enemy advances, and buying time for reinforcements, the 82nd Airborne influenced the broader outcome of Operation Husky, securing the foothold that would eventually lead to the liberation of Sicily and the disruption of Axis defenses in the Mediterranean. But perhaps the most enduring lesson is human. War is often measured in divisions, battalions, and casualties, yet the memory of courage under impossible conditions transcends statistics. In those scattered, desperate hours, ordinary soldiers became agents of extraordinary impact. Their improvisation, their initiative, and their will to survive redefined what it meant to fight in an airborne campaign. The German paratroopers would continue to fight fiercely throughout the Sicilian campaign, yet the encounter with the 82nd Airborne left an indelible mark on both sides. It was a confrontation where expectation met reality, where training collided with improvisation, and where the courage of a few reshaped the fate of many. In the quiet reflection after the dust settled, one truth remained: history is often decided not by numbers alone, but by the human spirit, adaptive, relentless, and unyielding in the face of uncertainty. And on that rugged Sicilian morning, the 82nd Airborne proved that even scattered men could hold the line, change the course of a campaign, and leave a legacy that would endure long after the guns fell silent.